Okay, good morning, ladies and gentlemen and humans. And it's delightful to see you all out here on a Sunday morning. Welcome to Gallery Serpentine. I'm Sarah Mathieson, and I'm going to talk to you today about Boudicca or Boudicca. Boudicca is the Latinized version of the name, which became more popular in the 18th and 19th century, but Boudicca is the name that Tacitus, who was the earliest chronicler of the events, that was the name he gave, so I'm going with Boudicca today. Okay, so what makes Boudicca great? So the time we're talking about is about the year 60 or 61 in the Common Era. So Nero is emperor of Rome. Rome is at its most expansionist period, so Rome has everything. And it's a very, Rome has a stranglehold on most of Europe and some of the Middle East as well. And so what Boudicca does is leads a revolt against Rome in Britain. And not only did she sack several Roman cities and defeat Roman troops, she came very, very close to throwing the British out of Britain in entirety. So that's pretty impressive for one person, even with support, even more impressive at the time for a woman. So, and a barbarian, because Romans very much disliked and disrespected what they considered to be the barbarian tribes, that they don't have hypocausts under their houses to make their floors warm. They don't eat larks' tongues like us. And, you know, they really disliked and disrespected barbarians. And because Boudicca was A, a woman, and B, a barbarian, they didn't take her revolt seriously until it was almost too late. And I kind of wish that they hadn't cottoned on, but history is what happens, not what we want, which is sometimes a great shame. So we don't actually have any British sources for Boudicca, which again is a great shame. Well, no written sources, we do have archaeological sources. But so the Roman sources that we have is Tacitus. Now he's quite a reliable source because he was actually alive at the time that the revolt happened. He was 4 years old, so he didn't know a lot about it at the time, but he was alive, and his uncle was one of the Roman centurions who was active in Britain at the time, so he would have had quite reliable information about Boudicca and her revolt. The other Roman chronicler we have is Cassius Dio, who was writing over 100 years after the revolt and probably is not quite as reliable simply because he wasn't alive at the time. And he was probably using Tacitus as his source. So he's pretty much a secondary source, but he does mention a couple of points which Tacitus didn't, which is a bit dodgy as far as I'm concerned, because how would he have found out? Okay, so the series of events. So in Rome, everything is happening as usual. Nero is having a great time being emperor. In Britain has been pretty much subdued by the Romans, and in Britain there were completely subjugated tribes and nations, and then there were client kingdoms where the kings were able to keep their title as long as they paid lip service and tax to the Romans. And Boudicca's husband Prasutagus was one of these client kings. So he was able to keep his title, but he had to pay the Romans a lot of tax, and he had to make really, really nice with them. So Prasutagus, in the beginning of this story, dies. He's not a very interesting guy. We don't really need to know a lot about him. But the interesting thing he did was leave his kingdom jointly to his 2 daughters and to Nero. He thought that this would placate the Romans and continue a friendly relationship between Rome and his own kingdom. He was really dramatically wrong about that, because not only under Roman law can women not inherit goods, property, money, well, anything really, they can also not be rulers. So putting Nero on the same level as two barbarian women was an enormous insult to Nero and to Rome. So the Romans get really upset. They come in and issue a proclamation that the Iceni tribe, which is Boudicca's tribe, are now 100% subjugated to Rome. They publicly flog Boudicca and they rape her daughters. So this was the event that pretty much caused Boudicca to then absolutely say, this is enough, we've all had enough, I personally have had more than enough. And so she then took this as her motivation to start her revolt. And Tacitus says that she takes her daughters up in her chariot before her and drives around the neighbouring tribes and say, we ladies have been done wrong and we demand that you help us get our own back. Whether this was true or not, it makes for a really good story. And as is often said, never let the truth get in the way of a good story. Tacitus also describes Boudicca physically at this point. He said she was a tall, strong, red-headed woman with a very commanding gaze and a very loud, rather low voice. The thing is, he probably wouldn't have known any of this information, but it was one of the stereotypes that the Romans thought of the British, that they were big, they were red-headed, they were strong, and they were shouty. And this is quite often shown in a lot of the texts and the art at the time, that Britons are big, red-headed and shouty, so this is what Tacitus went with because he was playing to his audience. And he knew that they'd understand immediately that stereotype. So Boudicca manages to convince all her local tribes that they should revolt against the Romans, because probably all the other local tribes were having a pretty tough time of it as well. And they march on Colchester, which was then called Camulodunum and was the capital of Roman Britain at the time. The Romans did have an idea that she was coming. They posted the ninth Legion to protect the city, about 200 troops against about 1,000 or so Britons. And they got absolutely annihilated, and the city of Colchester was sacked, burned and razed to the ground. And we've got very good archaeological evidence for this because there's a very thick layer of charcoal and ash in the geological strata that they're very accurately dated to the time, to about 60-61 AD, which was the time of Boudicca's revolt. So from Tacitus, and also from some of the archaeological evidence that has been unearthed, we know this was not a nice revolt. The population were not invited to leave the city before the looting. This was wholesale slaughter. Men, women, children, anyone who got in the way was, ruthlessly cut down. Some of them were hung from the city walls as a warning. Others were beheaded and their heads thrown in water sources, because the Britons, many of the Britons at this time, their religion included keeping the heads of their families to preserve their knowledge and their experience. So cutting off someone's head and disposing of it was a huge amount of damage to their family, because that knowledge, that experience would be forever lost to the family. So this was a really very big indicator of what Boudicca and the Britons thought of the Romans at the time. Okay, around this time, the Romans start to cotton on that something's going on that they probably don't like. But they still underestimate Boudicca, and she's marching towards Londinium, which is now London, and the governor of Britain, whose name was, according to my very extensive notes, Gaius Suetonius Paulinus. We'll call him Suetonius just so that I can keep on talking. So he was up in the north, doing a bit of a tour, making sure that everyone was towing the line and paying their taxes. He hears about Boudicca. He starts back towards Rome, but by the time he's gotten to Rome, Rome has gone the same way as Colchester. And there's a very exciting bit of evidence that's been unearthed quite recently. In 2013, there was some excavations done in London, and they found a large cache of skulls that would have been in what was then a stream. And they date, again, back to 60, 61 AD by the carbon dating. And so it seems quite likely that these were heads that were thrown into a local water source by the revolting Britons. That was a funny joke. Okay. Okay, so by this time, Rome has cottoned on that there's something going on. But the Roman troops in Camulodunum, in Londinium, and then in St Albans, where Boudicca and her, which is Verulamium, which is what was called at the time, simply did not have the resources to cope with the very, very, very angry Britons. But unfortunately, while Boudicca is sacking Verulamium / St Albans, Suetonius is actually setting a trap for her. Because even though the Britons are very cranky, and there are a lot of them, the Romans do have better military training and a lot, and very, very wide experience of tactics. So Boudicca gets drawn out into a battle where we're not exactly sure where it happened, which is very sad because I would really, really like to investigate where it happened. But we know it was a large open area that narrowed into a defile that was covered by woodland. So basically, the Roman troops came out from the woodland area into the open area where Boudicca and her army were, then retreated under the attack into the wooded defile. The British troops followed the Romans, and basically then the Romans were able to come out, surround, and sort of squish and destroy, and then fight the Britons back towards their camp and wagons, which they had originally parked around the back of their army to stop the Romans from escaping, but it ended up, trapping them against, a huge and well-trained Roman army. So that was a tactical error, which ended up in routing the British troops and pretty much general slaughter of the British troops, which is very, very sad. Boudicca and her two daughters escape, but very shortly after this are found dead. Now, whether, as Tacitus says, they poisoned themselves to avoid being captured, or whether, as Cassius Dio said, it was a sudden illness, I personally think either is possible, but I think probably poison is more likely, because Boudicca would not have enjoyed being treated as a Roman prisoner was treated when they had been a very visible force against Rome, which is you get dragged behind a general's chariot through Rome in a giant triumphal parade, and then you get tortured to death. So Boudicca would not have liked that at all. So I think that, in fact, she did commit suicide. But as I say, we don't really know for sure. Okay, and after this, Boudicca is more or less lost to British history, which is very, very sad, until the Age of Enlightenment, about the 17th, early 18th centuries, when British scholars are reading through Tacitus and reading through Cassius Dio and going, oh, we didn't know about this lady. And so there's a sudden reintroduction of Boudicca into British culture, and everyone's like, oh my goodness, she was amazing. And she gets painted by John Opie, among others. She gets eulogised in poetry by William Cowper and Alfred Lord Tennyson. She gets the famous statue of Boudicca, Boudicca they call her, near Westminster Bridge, and Queen Victoria sort of adopts her as a kind of mascot. So even though she was forgotten for a very long period, she actually comes right back into British culture, and that's very, very nice. I personally have views on 19th century romantics and how they ruin everything for everyone. But they did manage to raise awareness of Boudicca, so those of us who aren't 19th century romantics can do a little bit more investigation. Thank you so much for coming out to listen to me today, folks. It seems entirely likely that I'll be doing another one of these little talks, and we'll definitely let you know onto Facebooks if this occurs. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen, and have a lovely afternoon.